The sun hammered down on the asphalt like judgment. Marcus Ryde Holloway sat straddled across his Harley-Davidson, a 1989 shovelhead painted matte black with silver trim that caught the light like broken glass. 58 years old, weathered face carved by wind and silence, eyes the color of storm clouds, the kind that had seen things that couldn't be unseen, his hands calloused and scarred, worked the fuel cap with practiced precision. At the Desert Rose gas station outside Flagstaff, Arizona, nothing moved except the shimmer rising from the blacktop and the occasional tumble of sage across the parking lot. Ryde had been riding solo for 15 years, not by choice, by necessity. The kind of necessity that came wrapped in regret and sealed with a promise made over the cooling body of a brother. He pulled the nozzle from the pump and watched the numbers tick upward. Regular, unleaded. 247 miles since Albuquerque. He could make Flagstaff before dark, hole up in some motel where nobody asked questions, drink whiskey until the memories loosened their grip, then ride again at dawn. This was his life now, forward motion disguised as living. The sound came first, a small voice, thin as wire, cutting through the desert hum. Mister, do you have a phone? Ryde didn't turn immediately. 20 seconds passed. He finished pumping, replaced the nozzle, capped the tank. Only then did he swivel on the seat and look. A girl, 7, maybe 8 years old, barefoot, wearing a pink sundress torn at the hem and stained with what might have been juice, or might have been something worse. Her hair was matted. Her eyes, those eyes held the particular terror of a child who understood, on some primal level, that the world had stopped being safe. Ryde's chest tightened. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in Mirror once, 50 years ago, when his mother didn't come home and his sister asked him where Mommy went. "Phone's inside," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You need help, kid?" The girl nodded, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes, but not quite falling. Kids who'd learned not to cry. Ryde knew that look too. He stood, his full height casting a shadow across her face. 6'2", broad shoulders, motorcycle club patches on his cut, the kind of man who made mothers grab their children and cross the street. But the girl didn't flinch. She stepped closer. "I'm lost," she whispered. "My mom was supposed to pick me up from school. That was, I don't know how long ago. A man gave me a ride. But then he got scary. So I jumped out at a stoplight and I've been walking, and I don't remember where I live." Ryde felt something fracture behind his ribs. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Emma." "I'm Marcus. People call me Ryde." He gestured toward the station. "Let's go find that phone." They walked across the parking lot together, the 60-year-old biker and the terrified child, and if anyone was watching from inside the Desert Rose, they would have seen an image that didn't fit. Mercy dressed up in leather and chrome. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer. The attendant, a kid barely 20 with a name tag that said Derek, looked up from his phone. His expression shifted from boredom to suspicion when he saw Ryde with Emma. "This child needs to use your phone," Ryde said flatly, "to call someone who can come get her." Derek's face cycled through several shades of uncomfortable. I don't know if—" "Phone," Ryde repeated. Same tone, the kind of voice that didn't argue. Derek pointed to a landline behind the counter. Ryde lifted Emma. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and fear, and held her so she could reach the receiver. Her small fingers trembled as she dialed. Once, twice, 3 times, each time the same result. Voicemail, deadlines, wrong numbers. Her mother wasn't picking up. Her father's number, she didn't know. Grandparents, she wasn't sure. "That's okay," Ryde said, setting her back down. "We'll figure it out." He turned to Derek. "You got any food in this place? Anything that doesn't come from a cardboard box?" Turkey sandwich in the cooler. Been there since this morning. Wrap it up. And milk. The coldest milk you have. While Derek assembled the food, Ride led Emma to a booth by the window. She sat across from him, looking impossibly small in the vinyl seat. Outside, his motorcycle waited like a sleeping animal, loyal, patient, ready. "What's the last thing you remember?" Ride asked. "School, Lincoln Elementary. The teacher said my mum was late for pickup, so she let me wait in the office. Then a man came in. He said he was sent to get me. He had a car and he was nice at first, but then he—" She stopped, her voice fragmenting. "He put his hand on my leg, and he told me to be quiet, and I got scared, so I waited for a red light and I ran." Ride's hands became fists. He unclenched them slowly, breathing through his nose. Derek brought the sandwich and milk. Ride pushed them toward Emma. "Eat," he said gently. "Then we're going to figure out how to get you home safe. You understand? Nobody's going to hurt you again. Not while I'm here." It was a promise. He didn't know why he made it. Promises were anchors. They weighed you down. They demanded payment in blood and sacrifice. But looking at Emma's terrified face, Ride understood something that 15 years of solitude had made him forget. Sometimes the only thing standing between a child and the dark was a promise kept. He pulled out his cell phone and called the number for the Flagstaff Police Department. 40 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the Desert Rose parking lot. The officer who emerged was a woman in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, the kind of bearing that came from years of carrying other people's emergencies. Her name was Detective Sarah Chen. She approached Ride and Emma with the careful wariness of someone trained to see danger in unexpected places. A lone biker with a lost child fit every profile that made cops tense. "You the one who called?" Chen asked, her hand resting casually near her belt. "Name's Marcus Holloway. This is Emma. She was abducted from a school pickup around 2 o'clock. Escaped from the suspect's vehicle at a traffic light. Been walking since then." Chen's expression shifted. The professional mask of skepticism cracked just enough to let urgency show through. She crouched beside Emma, her voice dropping to something gentler. "Hi, Emma, I'm Detective Chen. Can you tell me what happened?" Emma recounted her story in the fragmented way children do, jumping between details, circling back, her voice steadying slightly as she spoke. Chen took notes. When Emma finished describing the man, thin, dark beard, grey sedan, couldn't remember the license plate, Chen's jaw tightened. "That matches a suspect we've been looking for," Chen said quietly. 3 attempted abductions in 2 months. "You did the right thing running." She looked up at Ride. "How'd you end up with her?" "She asked me for a phone at the gas station. I brought her inside, got her food, called you." "That's it?" "That's it." Chen studied him, his cuts, his weathered face, the way he sat protectively near the child without hovering. Something in her calculations seemed to shift. Ride had learned long ago how to read cops. This one was good at her job and decent enough to recognize a decent act when she saw one. "We need to take her to the hospital for an evaluation," Chen said. "Make sure she's physically okay. Then social services will need to locate her mother. You able to give me a statement?" Ride nodded. The next 2 hours dissolved into procedure. The hospital visit, where Emma was examined by a trauma-informed pediatrician. The police station, where Ride gave his official account. The coffee he drank while social services tracked down Emma's mother. A woman named Rachel, who had been at work, whose phone had died, whose life had cracked open into pieces when she finally got the message about her daughter. When Rachel arrived at the police station, she moved like something broken. Her eyes were red from crying, her movements jerky with shock and residual terror. When she saw Emma, genuinely saw her, unhurt, alive, she collapsed against her daughter, like gravity had suddenly become mercy. "Thank you," she sobbed, looking at Ride over Emma's head. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Ride nodded. He didn't know what to say. Gratitude was a currency he'd never learned to spend. Detective Chen walked him out to the parking lot as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. "You heading somewhere?" Chen asked. "North," Ride said. "Always north." "Well, if you're ever back through Flagstaff, there's a diner called Maggie's on Route 89. Owner's a good woman. Tell her Detective Chen sent you. You'll get a decent meal and no questions asked." It was a small kindness, the kind that cops sometimes extended to people who'd done the right thing in circumstances most people would have walked past. "Appreciate that," Rid said. He straddled the motorcycle, adjusted the mirrors, fired up the engine. The Harley roared to life, that sound like a prayer whispered by machinery. Chen watched him prepare to leave, her expression caught between professional duty and something more human. "Marcus," she said as he was about to pull out, "whatever you've done, whatever you're running from, you did something good today. Hold on to that." Ride didn't respond. He couldn't. The tightness in his chest wouldn't allow words. He just nodded, twisted the throttle, and guided the Harley back onto the highway. The road ahead was dark. The stars were beginning to emerge like wounds opening in the fabric of the sky. And Ride rode north, carrying the weight of a child's gratitude and a promise he'd made to a detective who saw something human in him he'd nearly convinced himself had died years ago. 3 days later, Ride was still riding north. He'd pushed through Flagstaff, threaded the high country of northern Arizona, and crossed into New Mexico, that desolate stretch of highway where the landscape became something mythic, where the silence was so complete it felt like a presence. He'd stopped at small motels, eaten bad diner food, refueled the motorcycle twice, and tried not to think about Emma's eyes or Detective Chen's words, or the fact that for 3 days straight he hadn't had a single drink. The Harley was running rough, not dangerously rough. Ride knew his machine well enough to sense when something was off. The engine had a slight hesitation during acceleration, a vibration that hadn't been there before. He chalked it up to the hard riding, the pushing north like something was chasing him. Machines wore down, people wore down, everything wore down eventually. He pulled into a truck stop outside Santa Fe just after dawn, the kind of place where the coffee tasted like regret and the waiters didn't make eye contact. While he was inside eating eggs he didn't taste, a young man approached his booth, early 20s, wearing a Harley enthusiast t-shirt and the eager expression of someone who recognized a true rider when he saw one. "Hey man," the kid said, "that your shovelhead out there? The Black Beauty?" Ride looked up. "That's mine." "Beautiful machine. I've been working on my own. 1987 Sportster. Wish I had the money for a real road bike like that." The kid smiled, eager for connection. "You heading anywhere interesting?" "North," Ride said. The kid laughed. "That's pretty vague, but I dig the philosophy. You need any help with maintenance or anything? I work at a shop in Santa Fe, just mentioning." Ride didn't answer immediately. Something in him, the part that had learned to live alone, to reject kindness, to trust no one, wanted to dismiss the kid. But another part, the part that had emerged 3 days ago in a gas station parking lot with a terrified child, recognized something worth acknowledging. "Engine's been running rough," Ride admitted. "Might need a once-over." The kid's face lit up. "Really? I could take a look right now if you want. My boss won't care. Shop doesn't open until 9. 20 minutes later, Ride's Harley was on a lift in a small garage on the outskirts of Santa Fe. The kid, his name was Tommy, worked with the methodical precision of someone who genuinely loved engines. He checked spark plugs, adjusted timing, inspected hoses. Ride sat in a plastic chair, drinking terrible coffee and watching the kid work. "Got a slow leak," Tommy announced after about 40 minutes. "Underneath the engine block. Probably been there a while, but it's getting worse, see?" He pointed to a dark streak of oil tracking down the side of the engine. Another week or two of hard riding, you'd lose pressure completely. At highway speeds, that's catastrophic. Engine seizes, bike goes hard, right, you're kissing a telephone pole. Ride studied the leak. Tommy was right. Another week of the pace he'd been maintaining, and the shovelhead would have failed at 60 miles per hour. At 60 miles per hour on I-25, catastrophic meant death, the kind of death that looked like an accident, that closed cases and moved on. "Can you fix it?" Ride asked. "Yeah, no problem. Pump seals worn. I can have you running like new by tomorrow afternoon." Ride nodded slowly. He thought about Emma pointing out the leak if she'd been riding with him. He thought about Detective Chen's words, about holding on to the good things. He thought about the machinery of chance, how a 7-year-old's observation, or a worn seal, or a kid who loved engines, could be the difference between breathing and not breathing. "Do it," Ride said. While Tommy worked, Ride walked through Santa Fe. The town was all adobe architecture and art galleries, and tourists in expensive casual wear. He wasn't a tourist kind of person. The galleries made him uncomfortable. Too much human emotion rendered in paint and sculpture, too much vulnerability on display. He found a library instead, quiet and climate-controlled, and sat at a computer terminal. He searched for news about the abduction suspect in Flagstaff. The search results came up quickly. Man arrested in connection with series of abductions in northern Arizona. The mugshot showed the thin man with the dark beard, identified as Daniel Rothstein, 41, with a history of violence and prior convictions. 3 attempted abductions in 2 months. 7 total victims over the past 15 years. He'd been in custody for 72 hours. Ride read through the articles methodically. Emma's name wasn't mentioned. They protected victims in cases like this. But Detective Chen's name appeared as the lead investigator. The article quoted her, "This arrest removes a significant threat to public safety. We encourage anyone who may have been a victim to come forward." Ride closed the browser window. He walked back to the garage just as Tommy was finishing up. The Harley looked the same black paint, same chrome, same soul. But now the engine would run true. Tommy was wiping his hands on a rag, his face flushed with the satisfaction of work well done. "She's purring now," Tommy said. New pump seal topped off the oil, ran her through her paces, smooth as silk. "How much do I owe you?" Ride asked. "150, parts and labor." Ride pulled out cash, peeled off 200 and handed it to Tommy. The kid's eyes widened. "That's too much, man." "It's not," Ride said. "You did good work. That leak would have killed me. Maybe literally." Tommy took the money, confusion and gratitude mingling on his face. "You're like the coolest stranger I've ever met," he said finally. Ride didn't respond. He straddled the Harley, fired up the engine, and felt the immediate difference. The hesitation was gone. The vibration was gone. The machine was whole again. "Where you heading?" Tommy asked as Ride prepared to leave. "Still north," Ride said. "But maybe I'll stop a little more often. Look at things. Notice things." He pulled out onto the highway, and the Harley sang beneath him, a song of gratitude and redemption and second chances, the kind of music that only came from knowing how close you'd come to the dark. Santa Fe, 7:14 a.m., Mountain Time. Ride's motorcycle just gained 15 more years of life. But something else is waiting for him on the road ahead. Something that will demand a different kind of payment. Subscribe to find out what. 2 weeks later, Ride was in a small town called Pagosa Springs, Colorado, sitting in a diner called the Timberline Cafe. He'd slowed his pace. Instead of pushing 150 miles a day, he'd been taking 50, sometimes less. He'd stop in towns, eat at diners, talk to people. It felt strange. This deliberate gentleness, this practice of noticing. He'd met a widower who taught him how to make proper coffee. He'd helped an elderly woman with her leaking roof. He'd played chess with an ex-Marine in a recreation center. The world, when you didn't rush through it, revealed itself to have depth. His phone, a cheap prepaid that almost no one had the number for, buzzed on the Formica table. It was Detective Chen. "Marcus, Sarah Chen from Flagstaff. I hope this isn't a bad time." Ryde's entire body went alert. Cops didn't call unless something was wrong. What happened? Nothing's wrong, exactly. But something came up, and I thought of you. Chen paused, collecting her thoughts. I was doing a cold case review, something I do quarterly, and I found a file about a disappearance from 1998. Young man, 23 years old, named David Holloway. Ring any bells? Ryde's hand went numb. He couldn't feel the phone anymore. What about him? The case was never solved, but it was flagged for review because of some new forensic technology, DNA analysis that wasn't available in 1998. I pulled the case file and found a reference to a David Holloway in connection with a motorcycle club investigation in Phoenix. There was a biker named Marcus who was interviewed about David's disappearance. The description of Marcus matched you pretty closely. Dark hair back then. I assume similar age. The Timberline Cafe seemed to be tilting. Ryde gripped the edge of the table. "He was my brother," Ryde said quietly. "I thought so. Listen, I'm not calling in any official capacity. This is personal. The case is old enough that statute of limitations applies to most people who might be involved. But I thought you'd want to know. We found something. A lead that might actually go somewhere. I'd like to talk to you about it in person. Would you be willing to meet?" Ryde couldn't speak for a long moment. David, his little brother. 17 years dead, the case cold enough to freeze, the wound he thought had scarred over suddenly reopened. "Where?" Ryde finally managed. "There's a diner in Flagstaff called Maggie's. You know it." Ryde smiled slightly despite the vertigo. "Yeah, I know it. Meet me there tomorrow at noon. I'll bring the file. We can talk through what we've got." Ryde agreed and ended the call. He sat in the Timberline Cafe, staring at his coffee, watching the cream swirl through the black liquid like galaxies being born. 15 years ago, he'd made a promise to David, a vow sealed in blood over a hospital bed in Phoenix as his brother lay dying from a wound that the official report said came from gang violence, but that Ryde knew came from something darker, something connected to the motorcycle club and the drug trade and the machinery of corruption that had consumed them both. He'd promised David that he would leave. He would get out of Phoenix. He would stop riding with the club, stop dealing, stop letting the darkness take pieces of him. And in exchange, David made him promise something else. Don't come back. Don't try to find out who did this. Don't let revenge be what your life becomes. For 15 years, Ryde had kept that promise. He'd ridden away from Phoenix, away from the club, away from any attempt to uncover the truth about his brother's death. He'd become a ghost on the highway, a man of silence and solitude. Now Detective Chen was telling him that the case might be solvable, that new evidence existed, that the 15 years of avoidance might be collapsing into a choice: face what happened or keep running. Ryde pulled out cash for his coffee, left a generous tip, and walked back to his Harley. He had 18 hours to decide whether to start a fire or whether to let his brother's death remain what he'd trained himself to believe it was: cold, distant, final. The road to Flagstaff stretched ahead of him like a question waiting for an answer. Maggie's Diner was exactly the kind of place Ryde needed it to be. Quiet, worn, authentic. Red vinyl booths, a counter with mismatched stools, waitresses who'd been working there long enough to know the names of regulars. A jukebox in the corner playing Patsy Cline, the smell of fried food and decades of stories. Detective Chen was already there when Ryde arrived, seated in a back booth with a cup of coffee and a manila folder. She looked different out of uniform, wearing jeans and a blue sweater, her hair down, looking less like a cop and more like a woman trying to carry bad news gently. "Marcus," she said, standing to shake his hand. "Thank you for coming." They sat. Chen ordered him coffee. She waited until the waitress had moved away before opening the folder. "David Holloway," Chen began, "disappeared on October 14th, 1998. Age 23. Last seen leaving a motorcycle garage on the south side of Phoenix. His motorcycle was found abandoned near the Salt River, but his body was never recovered. Initial investigation suggested gang violence. The garage he worked at was known for connections to organized motorcycle clubs. The case went cold in 2003 when the primary investigator, Detective Robert Morrison, transferred to Los Angeles. Chen pushed a series of photographs across the table. Ride recognized them immediately. His brother's motorcycle club jacket, the garage, crime scene photos from the river, and a photograph of David himself, smiling, young, alive, frozen in time at 23. "Last month," Chen continued, "I was reviewing old DNA evidence from the case. There was blood found at the scene that didn't match David's. It wasn't David's blood, it was someone else's. 26 years ago, we didn't have the database to match it against, but we do now." She pulled out another page. "The blood belonged to a man named Victor Castellanos. Ring any bells?" Ride felt something in his chest crack open like an egg. He was president of the club, Phoenix chapter of the Asphalt Brotherhood. But he died, 2004. Some kind of accident. "Not an accident," Chen said quietly. "Victor Castellanos was killed in what the official reports called a motorcycle collision. But new investigation suggests it was deliberate. Someone forced him off the road. Whoever did it was good, made it look accidental. No witnesses who would talk. Case closed." Chen leaned forward. "I think David didn't disappear. I think David fought back. I think Victor Castellanos' blood was found at that scene because David cut him, wounded him, during whatever happened that night." "Why would David fight back?" Ride asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because Victor Castellanos was involved in something that threatened David. And my theory, and this is just theory, Marcus, but I think you know if it's true, is that Victor killed David to protect that something. And then someone else killed Victor to protect David's memory, or to protect themselves, or because the debt needed collecting." Ride's hands were shaking. He put them flat on the table to steady them. "There's more," Chen said. She pulled out a photograph of a man Ride hadn't seen in 26 years. Robert Morrison, the original detective on David's case. He retired to San Diego in 2005. Lived quietly for 15 years. Then, last year, he reached out to the Flagstaff Police Department through a lawyer. He wanted to reopen David's case. He said he had information that had been suppressed in 1998. Suppressed? Morrison claimed that Victor Castellanos wasn't acting alone. He had a superior, someone in organized crime with connections that ran deep through Phoenix. Morrison said that in 1998 he was told in no uncertain terms to close the case or lose his career. He was young, with a family, and he backed down. But before he died, Morrison passed away 6 months ago. He wanted to make it right. Ride couldn't breathe properly. Who was the superior? Chen's expression hardened. That's where it gets complicated. Morrison's evidence pointed to a man named Carlos Delgado. Delgado had connections to cartel operations, money laundering, human trafficking. He was untouchable in 1998. Still was, mostly until his death in 2009. "Natural causes?" Ride asked bitterly. "According to the reports, cardiac event. But Delgado had a son, still alive, still connected, still operating." Ride stood abruptly. He couldn't sit anymore. His legs needed to move. His body needed to process what was happening. 15 years of silence. of refusing to look back, and now the case was opening like a wound that had never actually healed. It had just been bandaged. "Why are you telling me this?" Ride asked. "Because I think you might know things," Chen said carefully, "things that could help solve this. And because David deserves that. Your brother deserves to have the truth come out." Ride walked to the window of Maggie's and looked out at the parking lot where his Harley was parked, loyal and beautiful and ready. He thought about the promise he'd made to David. "Don't let revenge be what your life becomes." "If I help you with this," Ride said, "and if we find the people responsible, what happens to them?" "Justice," Chen said simply. "The kind that comes from the legal system. The kind that lives in daylight instead of shadow." "That's not the kind of justice the Asphalt Brotherhood understands." "No," Chen agreed, "but maybe it's the kind that David would have understood." Ride turned back to face her. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes held something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of light off glass. "I need to make some calls," Ride said. "I need to tell people about this." "What people?" "Brothers," Ride said. "Not the club, real brothers. Men I rode with before I left. Men who loved David. They deserve to know the truth before we move on this." Chen nodded. She understood the code without it needing to be explained. Some things came before the law. Some things came before everything. "Take the folder," Chen said. "Read through it. Memorize what you need to memorize. Then contact me and we'll figure out next steps." Ride gathered the folder and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting this die." "Thank you," Chen replied, "for raising the kind of man who fought back. Like this video, if you believe that justice, real justice, is worth fighting for, comment what you think happens next." For 3 days, Ride made phone calls. He called Tommy in Santa Fe and asked him to ride north. He called Detective Chen and explained that he needed time to gather the people who had been close to David. He called a man named Jack Reeves in Prescott, a man named Samuel Ghost Morrison in Tucson, and a man named Pedro Valdez in Phoenix. All of them had ridden with Ride in the old days. All of them had loved David like a brother. All of them had left the club in the years after David's disappearance, unable to stay in an organization that had been built on a foundation of lies. They came. Jack Reeves was 70 now, grey-bearded, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had accumulated damage over decades. He rode a vintage Indian motorcycle, cherry red, and the sight of it in the Flagstaff Diner parking lot made Ride remember why the road had always meant freedom. Samuel Ghost Morrison arrived on a Triumph, lean and dangerous-looking despite his 64 years. He'd been the strongest rider of their generation, the one who could coax impossible speeds from machines and dance through traffic like it was choreography. He hadn't ridden hard in 15 years, but it was coming back now, the muscle memory of velocity. Pedro Valdez came with his son, Miguel, a younger man in his 30s who'd grown up hearing stories about Uncle David, the one who'd tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. Pedro was 68, running a legitimate auto shop in Phoenix, having built an honest life on the foundation of his past sins. They gathered in Maggie's diner after closing, when the waitress had gone home, and it was just the 5 of them, Ride, Jack, Ghost, Pedro and Miguel, sitting around a large table that had never been meant to hold this particular combination of ghosts and the living. Ride laid out what Detective Chen had told him. He showed them the photographs. He told them about Victor Castellanos, about Carlos Delgado, about the blood at the scene, and the theory that David had fought back, that David had wounded his killer before going into the dark. David was defending himself, Ride finished quietly. And then someone, maybe one of us, maybe someone else, made Victor pay for what he'd done. "It doesn't matter," Ghost said, his voice still carrying the rasp of a man who'd smoked cigarettes for 40 years. "What matters is that it's time to bring it into the light." "There's a son," Ride said. "Delgado's son. His name is Rafael Delgado. He's 39 now. He's not as obvious about his operations as his father was, but he's still connected. He's still operating out of Phoenix." "You want to go after him?" Pedro asked quietly. "I want to help Detective Chen build a case. I want to tell her everything I know about the club structure in 1998, about who reported to whom, about the pattern of violence." Ride met Pedro's eyes. "I want David's death to mean something other than a closed file and a broken family. And if Rafael Delgado decides this is a threat?" Miguel asked. "He has resources. He has people. Then we make sure he understands that harming any of us is a mistake that costs too much," Ghost said flatly. "No," Ride said. The word cut through the tension like a blade. "That's the old way. That's the reason David died in the first place. We do this clean. We do this through the law. We do this in daylight." "That's not going to get you justice," Jack said, not unkindly. "That's going to get you process. That's going to get you procedure. That's not the same as justice." "I know," Ride said, "but it's the kind of justice David asked me to pursue when he died. And I've spent 15 years running from that promise. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life doing it." They sat in silence, the weight of that commitment settling over them like snow. "Okay," Pedro said finally, "tell us what you need." Over the next 8 hours, they reconstructed the past. They told Detective Chen, who arrived at Maggie's at 4 a.m. with a recording device and a notebook, everything they could remember about the Asphalt Brotherhood's operations in 1998, about the power structure, about the people who had died or disappeared in the years since. They provided names, dates, details. They gave testimony that no witness had been willing to give in 1998, when fear was still fresh and the club's reach seemed infinite. By the time the sun rose on Flagstaff, Chen had enough to begin building a case. "I'm going to take this to the FBI," Chen said as the meeting was breaking up. "The interstate connections and the organized crime elements mean it might involve federal jurisdiction, but I wanted you to know first. I wanted you to understand that we're going public with this." "How long?" Ride asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Enough time to review everything you've given me, to cross-reference with existing files, to build the narrative. After that, we'll probably move on an arrest warrant for Rafael Delgado and launch a full investigation." Ride nodded. 2 or 3 weeks until the ground shook. 3 weeks until the past became the present and demanded to be reckoned with. The 5 men walked out into the Flagstaff mourning together. Their motorcycles were lined up in the parking lot like a prayer rendered in metal and chrome. Sunrise was coming, that moment when darkness surrendered to light, when secrets became visible. "What happens to us now?" Jack asked as they prepared to mount up. "We ride," Ride said. "Together this time. For David." They fired up their machines and pointed them south, back toward Phoenix. Back toward the place where the story had begun, back toward the place where they would help bring it to an end. The sound of 5 Harley engines in unison was something close to music, something close to redemption. 2 weeks later, Rafael Delgado was arrested at his office in Phoenix, a legitimate-looking import-export business that everyone in Phoenix law enforcement knew was a front for laundering money and coordinating operations. The arrest was televised. The evidence was presented in a press conference. Detective Sarah Chen stood at a podium and outlined the case, from David Holloway's disappearance in 1998 through Victor Castellanos' suspicious accident in 2004, through the new forensic analysis that connected everything. What she didn't mention was that the break in the case came from a lone biker who'd found a lost girl at a gas station and decided that mercy was worth the risk of opening old wounds. Rafael Delgado maintained his innocence. He hired expensive lawyers. The case was complex. David's body had never been recovered, which complicated things. The evidence against Victor Castellanos was circumstantial. The evidence connecting Rafael to Victor's death was even more circumstantial. But what the case had was momentum. Once the first dominoes started falling, others fell with them. Witnesses who'd been silent for 26 years suddenly found their courage. Men who'd been in the Asphalt Brotherhood in 1998 came forward. A forensic accountant found evidence of money laundering connected to Delgado's operations. The machinery of justice, once it starts moving, is difficult to stop. Ride watched from a distance. He gave his testimony to the FBI. He answered questions. He told them things that had been buried for a quarter century, and then he did something that surprised even himself. He showed up at Maggie's diner every morning at 7 a.m. and had breakfast with Detective Chen. "You don't have to do that," Chen said one morning, stirring sugar into her coffee. It was the 4th week of the investigation, and Rafael Delgado's trial date had been set for the following summer. "Yes, I do," Ride said. "You brought David back to life. Not physically, I know that. But you brought him back into the world. You made him matter again, instead of just a closed file." Chen smiled. It was a small thing, but it contained kindness. "You did that. You taught me that sometimes the most important cases are the ones nobody's been working on. You taught me that a man can spend 15 years riding away from his past and still come back to face it when it matters." "What happens to Rafael?" Ride asked. "If the trial goes the way we expect, he'll spend a significant portion of his remaining life in prison. That's not the same as solving David's death. We may never know exactly what happened that night. But it means Rafael can't hurt anyone else. It means the organization starts to disintegrate without his money and connections. It means the debt gets paid." "Not vengeance, though," Ride said. "No," Chen agreed. "Justice, which I think is what David would have wanted." On Ride's last morning in Flagstaff, before he was scheduled to leave and return to his life on the road, a small girl came through the door of Maggie's diner. It was Emma. She'd remembered the diner, or someone had told her. Or it was simply fate operating through channels that couldn't quite be explained. She was with her mother, Rachel, who recognized Ride immediately. "Mr. Marcus," Rachel said, moving toward him with a smile that carried profound gratitude. "I didn't know if you'd still be here. Emma wanted to find you. She wanted to say something." Emma stepped forward shyly. She was 9 now, healthier than she'd been that day in the Desert Rose gas station, the terror fading from her eyes, though Ride suspected it would never fully disappear, that some wounds lived inside and shaped a person's relationship with safety for the rest of their life. "I wanted to thank you," Emma said, her voice steady, "for helping me, for making sure I was safe." Ride looked at this child he'd rescued. And he thought about his brother, and he thought about all the ways that kindness ripples outward into the world, creating changes that can't be undone. "You're welcome," he said simply, "and I want you to know that you're brave. You were brave that day, and you've been brave since. That's not going to change." Emma smiled. They took a photograph together, Emma, Rachel, and Ride, and the waitress at Maggie's snapped it on Rachel's phone. It was a strange portrait, a lost child found, a brother avenged, a man returned from the dark. When they left, Ride sat alone with his coffee and his thoughts. Detective Chen had gone home to pack. The investigation was in the hands of the courts now. The brothers had returned to their lives, Jack to his small ranch, Ghost to his legitimate repair shop, Pedro to his auto business, Miguel to his job as a carpenter. The road was calling again, but it felt different now. The road felt like freedom instead of running. It felt like purpose instead of escape. Ride paid his bill, left a generous tip, and walked out to his Harley. The sun was rising over Flagstaff, that moment when darkness surrenders and light takes hold. The motorcycle was ready, faithful, waiting. Ride straddled the seat, fired up the engine, and felt the familiar vibration of a machine that had been saved by a small girl's observation of a leak that nobody else had noticed. He thought about the chain of events, the leak beneath the engine, the brake line that would have failed, the accident that would have looked accidental, the 15 years of running that would have ended in the dark. One small observation, one act of mercy, one decision to stop for a child and help her find her way home. That's all it took. Ride twisted the throttle and pointed the Harley north. The road stretched ahead, infinite and possible. Behind him, Flagstaff was already becoming memory. But it was a good memory, the kind that changed a person, the kind that reminded you why redemption was worth the cost of breaking your own heart. 6 months later, Rafael Delgado was convicted of murder in the 2nd degree, not for David's death, which remained technically unsolved, but for orchestrating Victor Castellanos' death, which was now understood to be an act of covering up a crime. He received a sentence of 35 years. At 39 years old, it meant he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Justice didn't bring David back. Justice didn't restore the years that had been lost or the family that had been broken. But justice meant that the debt was acknowledged, that the crime was not permitted to rest in shadow, that truth had been dragged into daylight where it belonged. Ride learned about the conviction the same way the rest of the world did, through the news. He was in a small town in South Dakota when his phone buzzed with a text from Detective Chen. David's story is closed, but his legacy continues. Ride wasn't sure what she meant until he saw the follow-up text. Local police department just started a cold case unit. David's case inspired them. Your brother's helping solve other cases now. Ride pulled over at a rest stop and let himself cry for the first time in 25 years. He cried for David, for his brother who had tried to do the right thing and paid with his life. He cried for the 15 years of running, of silence, of refusing to face what had happened, and he cried with gratitude that the pain had finally been transformed into something that could help others. He called Tommy in Santa Fe. Tommy had gone back to school, was studying engineering, wanted to build something bigger than just fixing motorcycles. "This whole thing with your brother," Tommy told him, "it made me realize that everything we do matters. Every choice ripples out. I wanted to be part of something that mattered." He called Jack, Ghost, Pedro, and Miguel. They were talking about creating a foundation in David's name, something that would help young people, especially those in high-risk situations who needed guidance and protection. They were going to use their own stories, their own redemption, as a pathway to reach others. And he called Detective Chen, and they made plans. She was being promoted to lead the new cold case unit. She wanted Ride to consult with them, not officially, not in any capacity that would appear on records, but as someone who understood the machinery of old wounds, who knew how to read between the lines of files that had been closed and forgotten. "You don't have to say yes," Chen told him when they met at Maggie's diner again, this time in South Dakota, where Ride was helping with a consultation. "I know you want to ride. I know the road is what keeps you alive." "I do want to ride," Ride agreed. "But I don't want to ride away anymore. Maybe I could ride toward. Maybe I could ride with a purpose." "We could use a man like you," Chen said, "someone who understands both worlds, the legal world and the street world, someone who knows how to navigate the spaces between." "I'll do it," Ride said. 4 months a year I ride with my brothers. The other 8 months I help you with cases." It wasn't the life he'd planned when he left Phoenix 15 years ago. It wasn't the life of pure isolation and pure road that he thought he'd chosen. But it was, Ride realized, the life he actually wanted. The life where the past didn't chase you, but instead walked beside you, informing your choices, giving you purpose. 2 years later, Ride had become an informal consultant for cold case units across the western United States. He'd worked on 17 cases, helped solve 4 of them. He'd spent 4 months a year riding with Jack, Ghost, Pedro and Miguel, visiting towns they'd never been to, helping people they'd never met, giving back in small ways that added up to something significant. The David Holloway Foundation had given scholarships to over 100 young people who'd been in high-risk situations. Tommy had graduated and was now working for an aerospace company, designing systems for aircraft. Emma, now 11, had started volunteering at a victim advocacy center, and Ride had stopped running. He maintained a small apartment in Flagstaff, where he spent the months he wasn't traveling. He had a routine: coffee at Maggie's, meetings with Detective Chen, consultations on old cases, maintenance on his beloved Harley. He'd built a life that contained both movement and stillness, both the road and home. One morning, while Ride was reviewing files for a cold case in Nevada, his phone rang. It was a detective from Albuquerque he'd worked with before. "We found something," the detective said. "In a disappearance case from 1989. Your testimony was crucial in connecting the dots. We've just made an arrest." Ride closed his eyes. 35 years of darkness resolved into a single moment of light. A family would know what happened to their loved one. A case would be closed. He thought about David, about the promise to keep justice in daylight instead of shadow, about the machinery of redemption that had started the day a small girl pointed out a leak on his motorcycle. "Good," Ride said quietly. "That's good." He hung up the phone and walked out to the parking lot where his Harley was parked, faithful and beautiful and ready for the next ride. The sun was rising over Flagstaff, that moment when darkness surrenders and light takes hold. Ride climbed aboard and twisted the throttle. The engine roared to life, that sound like a prayer whispered by machinery and hope. He pulled out onto the highway and pointed the bike south, toward Nevada, toward the next case, toward the next family who needed the truth brought into daylight. The road stretched ahead, infinite and possible, and Marcus Ride Holloway, a man who'd spent 15 years running away from his past, was finally running toward something instead. Behind him, Flagstaff was already becoming memory. But it was a good memory, the kind that changed a person, the kind that reminded you why redemption was worth the cost of breaking your own heart. Thank you for watching this story. If you believe in justice, in redemption, in the power of keeping promises, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The road continues, and Ride's story is far from over. These are the real heroes, the ones who ride toward the light instead of away from it. Subscribe now.